know what they're getting into as we are beginning recording this meeting. So thanks, everyone.
I jumped the gun, but thanks everyone for being willing and bearing with us. All right, so I think that first I just wanted to say a couple of words before we launch in. So as you all know, the scope of these meetings is has to do with the Superfund CAG and the Superfund itself and the site, both operable units 1 and 2. And every now and then it touches on issues that relate to, and sometimes quite closely to either one of those units, either the residential area or the slag pile in the former smelter site, which is OU2. And in this case, there is an issue that has been, I think, is of a lot of interest to CAG members that relates to OU2 and some work that the city is doing, and particularly related to the unhoused community and residents who've been staying there. And so we're going to take, rather than taking time for the updates on OU1 and 2, the idea here is for Beth to put the updates in the chat. Those are also in the updates that you'll see the monthly site update that I sent with my email details, those updates, and then instead repurpose that time from now until 6 to just hear a little bit from Andrew, talk about from the city, and also talk about this recent action in OU2. So my proposal is to do that. I do want to make sure we switch at 6 to Jason's presentation because he was asked to come do this for a second time and we want to honor that time. But is there any concerns about that in terms of time-wise before we go ahead and open it up maybe to Beth to frame the issue and then take the next 15 minutes or so on this topic? Okay, wonderful. So I may have to cut us off, but I promise we'll be clear about the other venues in which this topic may be able to be raised. But with that, I think I'm going to turn to you, Beth, just to frame the issue and go from there.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. I appreciate that. So I will try to be brief because I do really want to give y'all time to raise your concerns and hear from Andrew, who's here from the city. So I think some of y'all may have heard last week, beginning on October 28th, the city was down in OU2 doing some work to remove vegetation and trash. We did receive their work plan in advance and we sent them some comments on that, primarily dust suppression, minimizing moving the contaminated soil in OU2, disposing of that soil properly, and then doing air monitoring. While that work was ongoing, or like starting on Monday, we received some calls from folks who are worried about some trees being removed by the roots, the removing of trash and belongings being staged in the park, and then dust that was blowing off site. After we heard those concerns, EPA did contact the city to make sure we understood what was going on and touch base. So the city believes the dust is from the asphalt material they brought on site as fill, that it's not from the contaminated soil. And they did share that they did have dust suppression on site Tuesday through Friday once they were able to get the water truck on site. Our next steps as EPA are gathering a little bit more information. Some of y'all asked about EPA's enforcement process. And so some of you who have been attending these meetings for a while will not be surprised when I say that I can't share a lot about EPA's enforcement process. That is generally a very closed door process until we have a final product that we can share with the public. But our next steps include gathering more information. We actually are going to have Erica go on site this week to look at OU2, understand the site conditions now after the work that happened, and kind of move forward gathering some more information there. I also wanted to share under EPA's enforcement authority, like our enforcement authority is still the same, and the city is currently considered a potentially responsible party since they own property in the Superfund site. So that's all still the same as it was before this action took place. Generally, under Superfund enforcement and like liability scheme, we can typically request potentially responsible parties to do work or to give us money to do work. That's generally how that works. So I just wanted to lay that out because I know enforcement is, EPA has a whole lot going on with enforcement. So I wanted to kind of give a summary of that. I also want to take a couple seconds and summarize some of the main concerns that we got. So a lot of the concerns for EPA were about access to the site, why the city was allowed on site while we've been restricting access to others, what we're going to be doing about following up on those complaints, especially regarding health, and then what enforcement EPA will take against the city. I also have a list of questions for the city. Ryan, do you want me to post those in the chat?
That'd
Okay.
be great. Yeah,
So
if you don't
that's
mind.
that's the end of my little summary. I wanted to just kind of lay out the facts as I understand them and open it up to folks.
Thank you. And is there anyone, did anyone want to like amend or clarify from the city before we just open it up to folks to hear concerns or questions? I know that you all received some questions from EPA.
If you're okay, I'll just kind of lead in here, give a quick overview of kind of what we've done, what we started, what we're working on right now, and kind of where we're at. But Beth framed it correctly as far as the timelines there. We started on October 28th, which was a Monday. Basically setting up accesses through the area that is behind Benedict Park and out on property that is currently owned by John and Mary Starr. So what we did was bring in some outside fill material to create a ramp to be able to access those areas with equipment and dump trucks. So that was most of our activity on Monday. There was also some trash removal activity that was taking place just to the south under Mesa Avenue Bridge, starting on that Monday as well. So there was some trash removal that took place outside of Mr. Starr's property at that time. The Tuesday is when most of the trash removal on Mr. Starr's property began. And in order to get there, there was vegetation that needed to be removed, obviously, to provide access for vehicles coming through the area. Water trucks, as we were starting to move vehicles through that site, water trucks were there making passes every hour or as needed to be able to suppress the dust, keep things down there. And ultimately, trash materials were picked up and piled in there and then loaded in dump trucks and hauled out to locations where dumpsters were, either in Benedict Park or to the north near the, again, the access that kind of came in out from Mr. Starr's property off of Santa Fe. So those activities pretty much wrapped up on that Friday, which, the date was November 1st on that Friday. So most of those abatement activities on Mr. Starr's property ended at that time. There was vegetation removal that was going on. As pointed out, there were some trees that were removed, dead trees, particularly trees that were damaged, trees that were burned, and then lower shrubs and vegetation that were back there as well that were concerned. Those were also removed. And then the materials that were removed are up on the Benedict Park site there. So there's some trees there waiting to be mulched. That mulch is going to be returned back to the area where there's fill exposed at this point. So the activities that took place again were removal of trash and litter, the removal of low vegetation, removal of some trees that were dead, damaged, burned, and trimming of trees where we prune trees up also as well. So the wood material again is going to be returned back to that site, and approximately 20 dumpsters worth of trash and debris were removed from the site. We're still waiting for the final invoices to come in, so I don't have the tonnage or that information. But I think that's a pretty good summary of kind of the activities that took place. Again, at this moment, there's still trees waiting to be mulched, so those will be done, and then that mulch will be returned back to the site. Waiting for the site to dry out a little bit. If anyone's not in town right now, we've had some weather, obviously recently, and so the snow melt has left that kind of soft soil there. So we're waiting before we go drag a bunch of equipment back over that to get that work done. But that should be done, I would guess, in this next week or two here.
Okay.
Take any questions you've got.
Great. So do folks have questions? And if so, feel free to just raise your hand and I'm glad to call on you. Or people can put questions in the chat. Yeah, Jimmy. Go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Hayes, I was there Monday and Tuesday until about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I didn't see a water truck.
So Tuesday, there was definitely a water truck on site. Monday, again, they were bringing fill onto the site. So it was just a clean fill that was being placed to build the ramps there. So there weren't any dust causing activities, I guess, going on that particular day, other than the fill that was dumped out of the dump truck, but that was clean outside fill that was being brought. So the water trucks were definitely there on Tuesday.
Do you know what time they came?
They came out with the crew that morning, so the truck was making laps every so often. But I don't know where you were standing or maybe missed it, but it was definitely there Tuesday morning out with the crew.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thanks, Jimmy. Are there other questions?
Real quick, if I could say something, Ryan.
Please do. And then I see Velma's got her hand up
No.
after.
I just wanted to thank you, Mr. Hayes, for all that you guys have done. I think that's a huge benefit. You eliminated a massive fire risk in that area, I'm sure, in the process, it sounds like, which you easily could have gone up that hill and taken out part of the neighborhood time to time. So, and I encourage the EPA to take advantage of all the efforts that the city has now put into cleaning up this project and go in and do a little better sampling on the site now that you have better access and it's you're not as afraid to be there. So, which I didn't blame you for being afraid to be there. Oh, but anyway, thanks again, Mr. Hayes. We appreciate all your work.
Thanks for your
Thanks,
comments.
Harold. Velma.
Find the right buttons. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hayes and Mr. McCain for being here and discussing this. While I appreciate Eric's perspective on it and the respect to concerns for fires and other hazards. I was and am one of the people who was disturbed by the process that I observed going on. Unlike Jimmy, I wasn't able to spend the whole day there on any one of the days, but there, even when I was there, I was able to observe the trucks and heavy equipment going up and down the hill. I observed the new road that had been carved into the site. And while I understand that you're telling us that you brought in fill to create that road, the process, I'm concerned because the trucks and equipment, even bringing in the new fill and also the process of removing the vegetation and material that was more than just surface or deeper than just right on the surface, like trash and tents and things like that, would have inherently and of necessity disturbed the soil and the slag material in the removal of vegetation. Anybody who's ever weeded their garden knows you can't pull up weeds and tear up shrubs and small trees and things like that without disturbing the soil and the material. I call it soil, but it actually was contaminated, hazardous waste material. So I guess my question is this, and it's sort of, I'm not sure exactly to whom to direct it. So I guess either EPA or the city and could answer this. And I understand that some of these matters are in legal proceedings. And since I feel very strongly that the potential for violation of procedures and protocols needs to be strongly investigated, I understand that investigation, while it's ongoing, may be confidential, but I believe that the community, however the investigation comes out, the results of that investigation, as well as extremely detailed reports as to the evidence and the thought that went into that report, will those be made public once the conclusion is reached about the potential enforcement procedures? And also, will the results of any dust and air sampling done during the renovation of the site be made public as part of that? Thanks so much. And, you know, I understand to the city folks that some of us are pretty, well, I shouldn't say some of us, me, I'm pretty worked up about this. And so I have some stronger things I could say, but I won't because they run into the realm of opinion. And I'm hoping the investigation will answer a lot of those questions.
So Velma, I want to make sure I'm understanding your question, right? It sounds like you're kind of, oh, sorry. Okay. You shook your head and then nodded. So it sounds like you're asking about EPA's enforcement process, right? Okay. So I think,
I'm having a little, I'm sorry.
oh, that's
I
okay.
didn't mean to talk over you. I'm getting a little delay. Let me turn off my audio and video, and then would you please repeat what you just said?
Yes, 1 second. Thanks, Velma. Okay, hopefully that's better. I also, thanks Velma for putting your questions in the chat. That's super helpful. So I wanted to clarify your question about the reports. Okay, thanks for the thumbs up. So EPA, I don't think we will have reports on the enforcement process. So I wanted to clarify our enforcement process is kind of looking at liability in the Superfund realm of things, not necessarily like trespassing. So EPA like does not enforce access like the city. And Andrew, you can clarify anything that I'm getting wrong here. This was an enforcement action by the city to do this removal. So that's not something that that EPA is going to take action on. But I think what I can say about our enforcement process is that typically there is a legal document that's made public at the end. And that document is something that we can share that kind of explains what we're doing and who's going to be taking action. So hopefully that explains that question.
But
And Sydney, I saw your hand up at one point. Did you want to chime in here?
I'll let Andrew go, and then I'll try and tackle whatever he does not tackle in Velma's questions, and then we can go from there. So yeah, Andrew, go ahead.
And I just wanted to make a note, sorry, Andrew, that it's 6. And so my hope is that we can take 5 more minutes on this and then transition. Is that okay with everybody? And EPA, is that okay? 5-minute delay? Okay. Thanks,
My
Jason.
hope is that we'll come back to it.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we need to do as we wrap up this conversation after we hear from a couple of people here is to figure out where are the other venues, if at all, that this conversation can happen. Because my understanding is that there are 1 or 2 venues in which that can happen. So anyway, but yeah, duly noted. And Andrew, go ahead, please.
sure, I'll be brief just to keep you on track here. But in general, the city's action there was a code enforcement, or I guess abatement of a code enforcement violation related to trash and litter on the property. So that was posted prior to, I believe, around October 18th or so. And that was the city's response there to get the litter and trash cleaned up back there on the private property. That was the purpose of the action. I will. There's several questions here. So Velma's question posits that there is an investigation going on. The city is not conducting an investigation. We've been very transparent, I guess, about the activities that have taken place. It was in the open. It was not as Jimmy pointed out, he was standing on the bridge or nearby and was able to see what we were doing. And Velma, you also pointed that out as well. So there's no hidden activity that was going on. People could see from the highway as well, the equipment back there. But in general, again, the materials that were removed were trash and litter. We were not removing fill from the site. Certainly there's incidental material attached to the trash and tents and those kinds of things, but it was not, buckets of fill were not certainly taken off or put into dumpsters to be hauled away. Again, the measures to keep the dust down were essentially the water trucks primarily where that access road was. That soil was it had some inherent moisture in it, so it wasn't creating a whole lot of dust to begin with. And the water truck certainly helped make sure that kept pace there. I saw there was a question there about wind speed. We didn't have a set wind speed that we were shutting down for, but we're monitoring visually any activities that were creating dust and making sure that as wind picked up, that we just stopped activities. There was one point on Tuesday, I believe it was, where some winds picked up. At that moment, it was the crews were stopped working. They were at lunch, and so we waited until the winds were abated to come back and get started again on Tuesday afternoon. What other questions are here?
And I saw there was a question from Paul as well earlier. So I don't know, Paul, if you still have that question, but
Okay.
You're welcome to chime in. Unless, Andrew, do you see others that you wanted to answer?
So,
Well,
yeah, go ahead. So,
okay,
please, go ahead, Paul. Yeah, you're fine, please.
oh, I was just gonna say that it seems like from all the meetings we've had over the last couple of years that this is kind of an inevitability that was coming down the road here. We knew that at some point we were gonna have to be able to get in there to do the characterization and all the remediation and everything like that. I think I applaud the city for stepping up and doing that code enforcement. I had talked with Aaron before about the codes in that area had not been enforced for a good number of years, and that's why it accumulated so many people in that area. It just so happened that it was a contaminated area. And the reports we saw said it was really dangerous for people to be in there using that water in any way. That's the impression I got. So I think it was a good thing, and I'm glad it's done, and now we can move forward with more productive work.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Paul. Andrew, did you have more, or do you mind if I step in and just answer a couple of this from the EPA side as well?
Just one more little piece, I guess. Velma's comment that we'd carved a road that's not quite accurate. We brought fill in and placed on top of the place where we were needing to access. It was actually a pretty steep drop off at one point there where we couldn't bring vehicles in, and so we brought that clean fill in and basically established that ramp. But we didn't do earth moving activities back there. You might normally see for a road construction kind of project. There was equipment moving back there. There was vegetation removal, but it was not reshaping the soil in any substantial way. Obviously, if you're driving on it, it's going to move and shift underneath the equipment a little bit, but it was not being pushed with a blade or a loader bucket or anything like that. The activities that took place back there were, again, removal of the trash and debris litter from the site and using the equipment to pick it up and load it in the dump trucks that was then used to haul it back out to where the dumpsters were located. So I just want to clarify that piece, but please, Sydney, if you've got more to add, please do.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And I think just like kind of going off of that, and then I think we're gonna have to just wrap up on this to be respectful of Jason's time for coming back and for the presentation. Just to add to that, yes, I know a lot of concerns is like heavy equipment going down and everything like that. Have soils been moved inherently? Like, Velma, as you had stated earlier, when you garden, things do get moved up around. And so that is kind of what we have Erica going down on site tomorrow to just EPA itself has not been down there since this work has been done. We have had representatives out there and they were there speaking with Andrew and the construction workers as work was ongoing. So there has been a lot of communication between EPA and the city to understand what's going on. And now we will lay eyes down on site there. Something that I wanted to just like bring up and remind everyone is that when we're going down there and looking, when we do a risk assessment to see for human health or for ecological risk, what we're looking at is that 0 to 1 and 0 to 6 inches. So although, like, you know, let's say that some soils were moved around, that's what we're going to look at tomorrow, right? So did it really disturb that 0 to 6? And if so, do we need to recharacterize the site, right? So this is just things that it's an ongoing thing that we need to look at. And then we'll let you guys know as we start discovering, as we're coming to conclusions about it, in terms of, you know, the city doing things they weren't supposed to. This was a code enforcement action. And so their enforcement was to pick up the debris and to trim vegetation, to lessen the fire, to clear out what needed to happen there. There aren't procedures and protocols. This wasn't EPA work. There aren't things that we needed to oversee. There weren't work plans that we approved. There wasn't health and safety that we approved. This was a city taken action. And that's why, again, we invited the city to come here so that Andrew could clarify that for you. And, you know, I think that leads me into other avenues, because I think this is something that I think the community would like to discuss more, and we're happy to do that. I don't think that it's necessarily Superfund related as much. Like, it is to an extent, but not to where EPA can do something for that. So I think what we're offering up, and Beth, you can correct me or add to this, is that, you know, when we have our monthly OU2 unhoused calls, we can dedicate more time to this, because that is focusing on the unhoused and that situation. We're still looking into possible facilitation of OU2, and so that could be a forum it could go to. I think a lot of these questions might, again, need to go to the city, because with questions about, you know, the heavy equipment being tested, the air and dust sampling, like, again, that was work that was conducted by the city, right? So I'm looking at, the team is looking into seeing if we can put, if additional air monitors are needed downwind of the site, because now there is more soils exposed because of all that vegetation that's no longer there. And so we do hear your concerns, and we are looking into it, and we don't have all the answers tonight, but I think this is an ongoing conversation, and we want to invite that to happen. But it's just, tonight we can't answer everything, and we do have this, like, the agenda of asking Jason to come back and give this presentation. So I think that if you can either put in the chat and share that information.
Yeah, I
when
was
the
just
next
gonna
meeting.
add that, thanks, Sydney. The next date of, and I see Joan's hand, the next date of that unhoused call is on December 5th. If folks are interested in joining that, please put your name in the chat or just let me know. I know that Velma and Jimmy regularly attend those. If anyone else from CAG is interested in being there, please let me know, and I'll make sure that you're on the invite for that next meeting. I also wanted to highlight, related to unhoused topics, the city does have the Community Commission for Housing and Homelessness meetings. I don't know if that is the perfect venue for that, but I did just want to let people know that that is also a venue for some of these topics.
Okay, thank you. And maybe, okay, so December 5th for the call with EPA and NGOs, Housing and Homelessness Commission. Please put your name if you're interested in being invited to those. And Joan, do you have a comment before we move on here?
Yeah, just a quick one. I'm embarrassed to tell you, I am confused about the location and why EPA happened to be called into the site. What is this site?
Joan, in the interest of time, my suggestion is there somebody who can get back to Joan or like send a link? Yeah, I see Beth nodding her head.
Joan,
So
I'll send you an email clarifying where this is at. And I know Velma
Okay.
gave a thumbs up too, but yeah, Joan, I'd be happy to do that. I do want to make sure we can hear from Jason. So thank you.
Bet. It's not the Superfund site. Is that correct?
It is the Superfund site.
It is the Superfund site. That's all I needed to hear. Thanks very much.
Oh, good. Okay,
Yeah.
perfect.
Oh, interesting.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everybody. It sounds like this is not the end of this discussion in the sense that if people have ongoing concerns and questions. But I appreciate hearing from EPA, and Andrew, thank you for being here, and Brian. I think if people have follow-up questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And with that, I would like to transition to Jason, so I was not in at the CAG meeting this summer because there was a period in which the facilitation contract lapsed. So I missed the presentation, but my understanding was, Jason, that at least a couple people were there, found it extremely useful, and asked that you come back and do it again with a couple more people here. And you graciously said yes. And my sense is that it's just easier for you to do the whole presentation rather than try to do bits and pieces.
Oh, yes.
Yep. So we're
Yeah.
just gonna, so I think for those of you who heard this before, thank you for coming again. And I did, Jason, just so you know, I emailed the steering committee a couple weeks ago and just to see if people had specific questions related to slag and leachability. So, and I didn't hear back specifically. So I think people are interested in the general conversation. And I think my guess is there are going to be a number of questions. Some may be beyond the scope of the presentation and some may be even beyond the scope of like this particular site. But I think we'll just collect people's questions and people can put them in the chat as Jason talks. But I think we'll just let you go and then do questions at the end. Does that make sense?
That sounds great. Thank you.
Okay. So if anyone has questions, feel free to put them in the chat or just keep track of them. And otherwise, feel free to just go forth. And unless anyone from EPA wants to say anything else for contextual purposes.
I was just going to jump in before Jason started. I'm actually on leave. So I am going to hop off for the rest of CAG. I wanted to be here to help answer questions and try and answer as much as we could, but I am like, it's 8 o'clock where I am because I'm visiting family. So I will be working tomorrow. If you guys need me, please call me, email me, but I am going to hop off now. So thanks all.
Thank you for being here, even on leave. We appreciate it, Sydney.
Yep. All right.
Okay. All right, Jason Fritz, go ahead. You might need to remind people who you are too.
Oh, sure. Well, I'll start sharing, and I don't know how long Zoom is going to take to do that. So stand by for one moment. Apologies.
Great.
And then hopefully in somewhere between 5 and 100 seconds, you'll be able to see what I'm sharing. And let me see if I can get into presentation mode. And if that works. So,
seeing it.
So Ryan, are you seeing anything, I guess, first?
Yes, we're not seeing it in presentation mode, but we are seeing
All right, let me
the
fix
slide.
that. All right, I've mirrored it so that hopefully you'll be only seeing my title slide.
Yep.
Okay, and volume's good? People can hear me?
Volume's great. Yep.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you guys again. As was noted before, thank you to Velma and Jimmy specifically for your patience in sitting through this presentation one more time, because we had this, yes, it was given back in mid or early August 2024. My name again is Jason Fritz. I'm a toxicologist focusing on human health risk assessment for EPA Region 8. We support Superfund as well as all of the other projects and programs and divisions in the region. I'm going to minimize this Zoom interface. You know what? Zoom technical difficulties. I'll just leave my video on. It's easier that way, apparently. All right. So today we'll be talking about, so related because it's OU2, but a somewhat different topic, thinking about fate and transport. That's really how contaminants in the environmental media like soil and water move through that media and how people could be exposed. And the impetus for this presentation, our discussion again tonight, is concerns about migration by leaching or other processes whereby lead or arsenic or other contaminants could be, whereby people could be exposed to those contaminants in a way that would be, in a way that could cause some health effects that we want to prevent. So the Superfund remedial process, just as a highlight, I think most folks on this call tonight are very familiar with the process, but just to kind of orient everyone, for OU2 specifically, we are in the characterization phase. Now, OU1, now I have a map and a couple slides, but OU2 is the historical, and I'm specifically talking about the historical smelter footprint part of OU2. And that's the area we were just discussing with the city's recent cleanup. That's the area where the smelter activity used to be. I have some slides on the historical kind of background. The process has been slower for OU2 than for OU1. OU1 is the surrounding neighborhoods, the more traditional sheltered homes and residences and some commercial properties. The process for that was kind of fast-tracked because of the concerns for all those people's potential exposure for their children, for themselves, for their relatives and friends. And so that was fast-tracked a little bit farther along the process. Here for OU2 we're in characterization. So a bunch of things go on in characterization. It's a remedial site investigation. We try to understand the nature of release, fate, and transport, and how things have moved through the environment from where they were originally released to where they might be today. And as part of that, we also want to understand the baseline human health risk assessment and also ecological risks. So that's a little bit of orientation in the process. Once we have this kind of wrapped up, we would move into understanding what kind of remedies are needed and then starting the design and taking action for those remedies. And throughout this entire process, I do want to highlight that we do have community involvement, as we're doing today, CAG meetings and structured discussions, review of major documents and things like that. So a little bit of a cartoon of the timeline. And again, folks on the call probably are much more familiar with this than I am, having only joined the site a couple of years ago when I came to the region from enforcement. But a contamination was discovered over 10 years ago. It was listed on the national priorities list as a priority for the Superfund program nationwide 10 years ago. Today, we're talking about characterization specifically for OU2 and thinking about fate and transport. The current tentative timeline is that sometime in the next year or two, around 2026, we may have enough information to propose a remedy, to select one, and begin formal remedial action. Some removal actions or short-term kind of focus cleanups have taken place already, one in Benedict Park, but generally the long-term site-wide remediation happens after a remedy is proposed and selected. I promised a little map. This is kind of low resolution, so I apologize for that. But we're talking today specifically about the central portion of OU2, which is the historical footprint of the Eilers smelter that it operated, again, about 140 years ago. I have a slide with a little bit of details on that coming up. I'm not really talking about these other outlying portions of OU2 or really these surrounding neighborhoods in OU1 today. Excuse me, really focusing on OU2 in this center. I do want to talk a little bit about I mentioned a bunch of different things occur during the characterization phase, so I want to give a little bit more information about what that means. So we really start looking in depth, and by in depth I mean specifically looking at different locations and measuring concentrations of contaminants, different media. When I say media, I mean different things in the environment like soil, slag, surface water, pore water, and groundwater. And we do that to understand a couple different things. They're kind of highlighted by these blue columns. So physical site characteristics, source of contamination, and the nature and extent, by which we mean kind of where it is and how it's moved around from the historical release to today. And we use this information for my purposes for risk assessment. And some of the focus of my work is human health risk assessment. And that the focus of part of the presentation is really going to be on what kind of information is useful to understanding fate and transport, and what is more useful for understanding potential for human risks. So physical site characteristics and source of contamination, nature and extent all kind of go together. Really what we're trying to figure out is how and where contamination was initially released to the environment 100, 140 years ago, how it may have moved from that initial release through the environment, through the air, through the soil, through the water, down gradients, downstream, how it could have moved perhaps from the surface down into the groundwater, and then also specifically for risk assessment, where that contamination is today. So how much of whatever contaminants we're concerned about, in this case, lead, arsenic, and perhaps some other things, how much of those contaminants are in the slag? How much are in the surface soils? Where could people be exposed? And how much contamination are in those interface locations, the soils, the water, where people could be exposed, and air as well. So for human health risk assessment, as I mentioned, that's the focus of the understanding of the potential human health risks in the characterization phase. It incorporates a bunch of different elements, kind of boiled down into three parts. We gather empirical information, that's literally how much concentration is in specific media, regarding the contaminants of potential concern. Those are the things we think were released from the initial site activities that led to this site being listed on the national priorities list. So we do things like specifically we're talking about lead and arsenic as example chemicals for OU2 because they're likely going to be risk drivers for the site decisions for this particular portion of the Superfund site, which shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. So understanding lead and arsenic concentrations in the soil and the slag and the surface water. Then we also need to understand how people are currently exposed and how they could be exposed in the future to these current concentrations, these current site conditions. And that's understanding how people use the site. The unhoused discussion we were just having. Potential future exposures could be potentially anything, but most likely commercial, industrial, perhaps recreational. Benedict Park is a good example. So how those are different kind of exposure scenarios. I'll get to that in just a couple of slides. And we bring this information together, how much of the lead and arsenic is in the soil and the water, how people could be using the site and how they could be exposed. We integrate this information to have an understanding of risk. Now, as I mentioned, the historical footprint is currently zoned commercial. We do use current uses and zoning to understand potential exposure scenarios in the human health risk assessment, along with other lines of evidence. But EPA, as we've been discussing, is very aware that there are unhoused people, or at least there had been unhoused people in residence, and is including this type of exposure evaluation in the human health risk assessment. I should point out, this isn't on the slide anywhere, but this is fairly new for the EPA. We've been trying to find other examples of this kind of exposure scenario being specifically evaluated at a Superfund site, and we are not finding many examples at all. So but bear with me as I try to work through this process a little bit, because we're somewhat building the road as we're traveling along it, which is unfortunate, but it's the position we're in. So the remedial investigation, a little bit of background. As I mentioned, the Smelter, Colorado Smelter operated about 140 years ago for about 25 years, from late 1880s to 1908 or so. And after that, a lumber company operated for about 40 years from the 20s to the 60s. As I mentioned, I'll be talking today a lot about lead and a bit about arsenic, and those are two of our primary contaminants of potential concern, that the things that were released from the smelting activities that are highly concentrated in the slag. They're also at high concentrations in the surrounding soil, potentially, and also in the surface water in some sediment locations, and potentially in the groundwater. I'm not going to be talking a lot about groundwater today, but these releases occurred in the air, but also direct to soil in terms of deposition of slag. And then also there was releases to surface waters likely as well. And these releases occurred from the initial operations of the smelter. So they didn't just start when the smelter closed. They didn't start 50 years later. These natural processes I'll be talking a little bit about today have been occurring since the beginning. And the contaminants were initially released and have been moving through the environment via these natural processes now for over 140 years from the initial release. So one thing I've talked about in the past is a conceptual is a tool. We call it the conceptual site model. And it's just a way of thinking about integrating many different but relevant pieces of information, different lines of investigation, and trying to keep this information together to weave a tapestry or a coherent story that evolves as we move through the investigation and decision-making process. In the beginning, it's going to be very sparse. And as we collect more samples, as we talk to more people, as we start to analyze more data, we can add more levels of refinement and understanding to the conceptual site model. So the pieces I'll be talking about today will be highlighted in another slide or two. But it really focuses on, for the human health risk assessment, how contaminants were released, how they moved through the environment, and how people might be exposed. And this is very relevant for ecological risk assessment as well, although I'm not going to be talking about that today. So as I mentioned, the focus today is talking about how things move through the environment and how people might be exposed. As I mentioned before, EPA not only does this kind of academically or theoretically, we go out and sample, we collect data on slag and understand how much lead and arsenic is in the slag or in the soil, surface water, the pore water, the groundwater. We do multiple rounds of sample collection in some cases to evaluate a wide range of information, not just on how much is there, but as I'll get to in a slide or two, understanding a little bit about what the properties of that particular contaminant and how it might move. In addition to the properties of how it might move, we typically sample at several locations down the soil depth column or down gradient to get a better understanding of spatial distribution of how the contamination, where the contamination currently is, and understand how it may have moved from initial release 100 or so years ago. Some of this information is very helpful to understand nature and extent, fate and transport, but not too relevant to human health and exposure. Other pieces of this information is directly relevant to human health and human exposure, and also ecological receptors exposure. So there's a bunch of information that we collect, and some of it has very specific uses, some of it has very broad uses, and you may not necessarily be able to use all the information for all the things. That's why we have more specific or selective testing methods. So I'll talk about 3 in slides to come. Again, this discussion today is focused specifically on how EPA uses information we gather during this remedial investigation process to understand leaching specifically, because that was one of the concerns raised by you folks, by the community, among other means of environmental transport, discuss relevance of this and other related data that we do collect for human health risk assessment. So this is just a cartoon schematic that describes very, very high level how historical releases may have occurred from OU2, which is this former smelter operations. You see the smelter, there was 5 stacks at the maximum operations in the early 1900s, several waste piles and roasters, and you could have a variety of means of distribution of contamination from the piles, from the stack, from dumping slag onto the soil. And then you have OU1 being the residential neighborhoods. Again, we're focused today on the location where the smelter used to be, the historical smelter operations, OU2. So as I mentioned, the conceptual site model, which is this kind of circle in the middle of the diagram, gets information fed to it by a variety of different types of investigation techniques, looking at past use information, previous investigations, and so on. For today, we're going to focus on a couple elements of the past use, understanding the smelter, kind of operations, using historical photographs and records and insurance maps, and then also understanding information about modern day geology, media and transport, actual contamination concentrations in different locations at the site, understanding how it's currently used and how the site may be used in the future, and feeding that into what we call a receptor pathway network, which I'll show in the next slides, which is understanding how we connect exposure and transport through the environment to actual human uses. And I've said that in the callouts. So just a couple definitions. I try not to use jargon, but it's so much ingrained into my mind that it just seeps out. So I'm trying to explain some things. And if there's things I could explain better, please do save those questions for the end or put that in the chat. I'll try to touch back on those if there's words or phrases or acronyms that I'm using that are not super clear. But the conceptual site model and this receptor pathway network I'm talking about is going to link sources, which is where contamination comes from, whether it was a stack, if they still exist, or a waste pile or contaminated soil. Receptors, which for us today, for human health risk assessment, is people. It's like the little girl in the top who's been playing in the mud, perhaps, or the boys towards the bottom playing soccer. For ecological risk assessment, this would be birds, bunnies, bugs, bees, beetles, whichever. Pathways of exposure are ways that people come into contact, whether they're playing soccer or playing in the mud or just living their lives. And we combine this information together to create scenarios. So as I promised, this receptor pathway network, and I'm not going to talk in detail about all these different elements, but just as a high level connects sources, which on the left here are how contamination initially was released to the environment, in this case from smelter operations and deposition of waste piles. Release mechanisms and transport media are how we think about how these kind of releases occurred, whether it was a stack emission as a fume, weathering from waste piles. You note that leaching down here is typically an EPA investigation put into a mechanism of transport by which solid waste can move down through the soil, and I have a slide on that next. Transport medium, and then exposure medium. Exposure media is where people today or in the future could be exposed to contamination. For folks concerned about OU2 specifically, we would be highly concerned about people being exposed to contaminated surface soils, including slag, contaminating surface waters, and that's why those three are highlighted in brown. I promised a little bit more explanation about leaching. So leaching is really trying to understand contamination movement driven by downward migration of water, typically thinking that the contamination is on the surface soil and that you are contaminating lower depth horizons, that's deeper underground, by this movement of contamination that's mobilized in water. And it could be dissolved in water, or it could be particles that are just moving with water. Either way, you're getting contamination that was deposited on the surface down, down, down deeper into the ground, potentially impacting eventually groundwater. And this diagram is just very generally illustrating lower mobility not penetrating as deeply and higher mobility penetrating more. So there are a couple of methods you can use to directly measure or estimate leaching. EPA applies a variety of techniques. I'm going to talk about two specific procedures that EPA uses to understand the potential movement of contamination in water. In addition to these procedures, EPA, as I mentioned before, directly samples media, including surface water at various locations up and down gradient, pore water, and soils at different depth horizons. As Sydney mentioned, we surface 0 to 1 inches or 0 to 6 inches to understand kind of what might be immediately impacting humans and day-to-day activities, but we sample depth at deeper depth horizons. Sorry, the words escaped me. Deeper depth horizons as well. So the two of the procedures that we use to kind of understand leaching in the environment, the first one, they have horrible acronyms, but it's SPLP for short, the synthetic precipitation leaching procedure, and it simulates a kind of acidic rain scenario. So it has a mildly acidic pH of 5, and an incubation time of not quite a day, 18 hours at kind of an ambient room temperature. The other procedure is similar. The only difference is a lower pH. So the TCLIP, or toxicity characteristic leaching procedure, is actually a test that's required under RCRA for waste hazard characterization, and it's very similar, but instead of mimicking acid rain out in the environment, it mimics the acidic leaching that may occur in a landfill. So it uses a even lower pH solution. Otherwise, the scenario is the same. So if you were to hypothesize that mobility is related to pH, then you might see a difference in the mobility or the leachability of something using these two different tests. In fact, that is what we see. So this is a very busy diagram. I tried to just highlight 3 different responses, or 3 different measurements amongst the many that were done, specifically looking at lead being leached out of slag or ballast material with these 2 different assays. And again, just to try to simplify it, the SPLP simulates acid rain. And if you look at this kind of mildly acidic solution, as you might expect, you get lead leaching out, and it's in 200 or 300 micrograms per liter in these 2 different locations, one of railroad ballast material or near railroad adjacent ballast material, and one in a waste pile. And if you look in comparison using the assay that simulates the more acidic more acidic landfill condition, TCLP, you see the concentration is more than 10 times higher. It's 8,000 some micrograms per liter of lead. So, like I said, the slide is very busy. I just wanted to highlight a couple results for lead showing that, as you might expect, the more acidic conditions, or the landfill conditions with the lower pH, got more lead out of the waste pile into solution, suggesting that more acidic conditions would cause more migration or more leaching of lead out of solid materials like contaminated soils and waste slag. I do want to highlight that there's a little bit different considerations that I'm going to be talking about now for humans. So the leaching is very informative for understanding not just where contamination is, but where it may have come from, understanding that lower pH conditions, like in the landfill simulation, caused more lead to leach out of the solids. Also helps us kind of understand potential approaches for remediation if we were able to do something to neutralize pH that should reduce the amount of migration by leaching of lead and arsenic as well. But thinking about people, people aren't just like a landfill. People aren't just like acid rain. We're a little bit different. So when we specifically think about the unhoused now, which people who are literally residing on or in piles of slag, we don't have a very good information about how they might be exposed. They don't have, pretty much by definition, they have less regulated activity than the information that we have collected and tabulated for a variety of receptors like children recreating or adult recreators or workers or residents, people living and playing. So we really don't have a good idea of how they're exposed, but we have a good idea that they're likely exposed a lot more than someone who is just trespassing or randomly walking across the site, right? So we are very concerned about surface soil, as I mentioned, and surface water exposure. Typically in this type of environment, people are going to be exposed to surface soil, and we'd be concerned about the lead and arsenic primarily from ingestion. And that would be accidental or incidental ingestion is what we say. And in these scenarios, we find that this ingestion pathway typically accounts for the vast majority, or over 95% of the risk from the contaminated media in the environment. Now, however, the big caveat to that is if people are using the surface water intentionally for cooking or cleaning or brushing their teeth or drinking, then that is going to be a very significant pathway for risk as well. So we're both concerned about surface soil and surface waters. Both are important. Now, these pictures were relevant in August and not so relevant anymore, but they did at least document at the time different types of rationale for why we thought we might be concerned about different pathways. On the left-hand side, we see the picture of a tent camp with some kind of basin that's been used to collect either rainwater or surface water. I don't know, but there's a pot. I don't know if they're using it for cooking, for cleaning, for washing their shoes. I don't know, but they're collecting water for some purpose. Here we see a PVC pipe that was inserted as a diversion when there was a change in topography. So the water was falling. It's been diverted through this pipe, and there's a bucket nearby suggesting that the water is being collected again for some purpose I don't know. And on the right-hand side, we just see some of the vegetation that was discussed by Andrew Hayes in the city, and some of the tents that were and structures that were erected near some of our warning signs, cautioning folks against entering the Superfund site due to concerns about contamination and potential risk to human health. So I've mentioned this in some different ways, but to put a finer point on it, people, especially the unhoused, or people spending extended periods of time in these contaminated sites, like the historical footprint of OU2, can be exposed to surface oil, usually unintentionally ingesting or inhaling very small particles. They either get swept up in the air from dust and disturbance activities, including motorized disturbance of soil, but also getting fine fractions that just stick on your skin, on your hands, on your face, on your limbs. And as Velma mentioned, the gardening scenario is a great example. Anyone who's ever tried gardening or pulling weeds out of the ground, at least from my experience, comes in, usually washes their hands and turns this thing brown with the water that they're, removing soil from their hands. And if you just think about not having the capacity or the facilities to be able to wash your hands very well, or washing your hands in contaminated water, means that you're more likely to get some of that soil into your mouth when you're eating or when you're drinking, or accidentally getting into your nose, and so on. Again, we're mostly concerned about that contamination that gets into the body from ingestion or inhalation and then gets into the blood. Surface water, as I mentioned, is a significant concern. Most people, perhaps trespassers or site workers, might not be very highly exposed if they're just accidentally walking through shallow water once in a while. However, folks that may be using this water for some kind of specific purpose may be ingesting more, especially if they're drinking it. But even if they're just using it for cooking, for dishwashing, washing their hands and face, brushing their teeth, or so on. So we're very concerned about these media, because people could be highly exposed to contamination in both. I did want to point out, I know folks are very interested in seeing site-specific data. So this is just a high-level summary view focusing again on lead, and the different colors represent different concentrations of lead. There's 3 different colors, and the pink refers to lead concentrations that are above our industrial screening level of 800 milligrams per kilogram, and the dark red refers to even higher concentrations that are more than 2 times that. As you can see, this circled area is kind of around the highest concentration of slag piles. And you see that the red and pink is primarily next to those slag piles, but also down to another slag and flue run down here by Benedict Park. So you can see the concentrations are highest in these areas and do tend to decrease as you go north and down gradient. I just want to point that out because we do use a different type of assay to understand what we call bioavailability. And I have a slide that has, I think, a pretty good cartoon borrowed from our friends at CDC for understanding what bioavailability means. But just to explain it first and then show you in the next slide, bioavailability, as I mentioned before, is how much contamination gets into the body, specifically into the blood, following contact, exposure, and usually ingestion with contaminated soil. Now, for most contaminants and many chemicals, because we don't have a lot of specific information, as a health protective measure, we assume that bioavailability is 100%. That means that we assume that if you had accidentally ingested 1 gram of contaminant in some dirt, that all of that gram gets into your body and into your bloodstream. Now, for lead and arsenic specifically, the agency has had decades of experience and a number of studies evaluating how much lead and arsenic get into the blood because it's so prevalent across so many sites across the country. We now have good understanding that bioavailability is generally defaults to 60% nationwide, although we always want site-specific data. The way we get site-specific information on how much lead or arsenic can get into a human's blood is with a specific test that of course has its own acronym, which is in vitro bioaccessibility, IVBA. So there are some similarities to leaching. However, unlike simulating acid rain or simulating a landfill, this test simulates the conditions of a human stomach. So it uses an incubation time of that's much shorter, for an hour, and it uses a human body temperature of 37 degrees Celsius and a much lower pH with a stronger acid solution, a pH of 1.5. So whereas the leaching tests were designed to mimic different environmental situations, this bioavailability test is designed to mimic human stomach. Again, we're really concerned about how much soil people could be accidentally getting into their body, into their stomach, and then how much lead and arsenic could be coming out as a result of being incubated in the stomach. So I promised a little bit better pictorial depiction of what I'm talking about. In this case, this cartoon person has some particles on their hand that have accidentally or incidentally gotten into their mouth. They're going through their alimentary canal. That's their esophagus down to their stomach to their intestines. And in this cartoon, white particles represent those forms of, say, lead, which are highly bioavailable, which means they're get introduced into the body, they get into the stomach, and then they go out into the bloodstream, if you can imagine these being in the blood and in the body. Whereas the black particles are not bioavailable. They will go into the throat, into the esophagus, into the stomach, pass through the intestines, eventually pass out completely, not absorbed. So this is just an illustration, but what it's trying to illustrate is that different forms of contaminants and different types of soil will have different bioavailability. And it's very hard to estimate, which is why we preferentially, and we have done at Colorado Smelter, collected sample data and analyzed it specifically to determine what the bioavailability for lead and arsenic is. And we use this information to get a better understanding of potential human health risks and a better understanding of what kind of cleanup goals we need to adequately protect human health. So I want to show some site-specific data. Here we're looking at slag waste pile samples that were ground down to a fine fraction. And the reason for that is we don't expect that people would be putting large chunks of rock in their mouth. That's not very reasonable. We think that the most likely exposure is going to be those fines, those small particles less than 250 or 150 microns in diameter that get stuck to your face, that get stuck to your hand, and accidentally get into your mouth. We couldn't find a lot of those particles in the slag piles, so the slag itself was ground down to that small particle fraction. And as I mentioned before, we have arsenic on the left and lead on the right. The y-axis is the relative bioavailability with 0 at the bottom, and going up. Don't worry too much about the x-axis, which is the actual concentration of arsenic or lead in the sample. The red bar represents the default expectation for bioavailability based on basically averaging across the entire United States. So the take home from this, again, we're looking at slag piles, is that the arsenic bioavailability seems to be higher than expected, higher than default. There are a couple samples that are lower, but overall fairly high. Lead is also higher than expected, higher than default. So the take home from both of these is that both lead and arsenic seem to be more bioavailable in those slag samples that were ground than we'd expect based on the nationwide average data set. Now, to compare that to the next slide, which is surface soil. In this case, the surface soil had very small particles that we could access by sieving. So the soil wasn't ground. We just sieved it to get the fine fraction and then evaluated the bioavailability in the fine fraction. Again, arsenic on the left, lead on the right, relative bioavailability on the y-axis. In this case, it's scaled differently, but the red bar is still at 60% for both. And in this case, unlike the slag, the arsenic bioavailability seems to be much lower than default expectations. Lead, while lower than the slag, seems to be about average with what we had expected. So the take home from these two slides is that, again, with the slag on the previous slide, bioavailability for both lead and arsenic was higher than expected. The contaminated surface soil near slag had lower bioavailability, lower than expected for arsenic and much lower than the slag. And the lead was a bit lower than the slag and about the default expected value. So, okay. I want to touch just briefly on surface water and sediment because those were also things people were concerned about with good reason, absolutely. So just a very high level summary. We've taken several samples of surface water, and this slide is just highlighting a couple that exceeded the drinking water standard for lead. That's these have locations that are surface water 5 and surface water 12. If you recall, there's no overlay, but these are where the large slag piles primarily reside. I should mention that on the slide here, it says maximum contaminant level. That is the screening level that was used. That is a drinking water protection standard, which is very rarely used for surface water because surface water is very rarely directly used for human consumption. But we thought it was relevant in this case because of the unhoused people that were living on the site and potentially using this surface water for human consumption purposes, including cooking, cleaning, and potentially drinking. I will note that there were high concentrations in these two locations. Arsenic was high in one of them as well, but all the concentrations generally decreased to the north and down gradient. Similar, not exactly the same, but similar situation with sediment sampling, again showing lead. Again, this sample location 5 is highlighted for sediment. Sediments and surface water samples were generally collected in similar locations. We don't see an exceedance at this sample location, but now closer to Benedict Park, where we didn't have an exceedance in the surface water, we had a soil screening level exceedance in the sediment for lead. But like the surface water, concentrations generally decrease to the north and down gradient and off-site. So just have a couple slides left. Again, thank you for your patience with this presentation if you've seen it before, and thank you for your patience if you haven't seen it before. Thinking a little bit about short-term versus long-term risks. We absolutely don't want to miss a short-term risk while we're concentrating the focus of the investigation on preventing long-term risks. But the good news is that we haven't seen sample results from surface water that suggest an immediate or short-term risk. They're higher than we want. They exceed drinking water standards, but they're not concentrating in levels of concern for short-term human exposures. There certainly are very high concentrations of lead and arsenic in the slag and in surface soils that are near the slag, and sometimes in other locations at depth, particularly in or near the slag waste piles, like I illustrated a couple slides ago in the central portion of the historical smelter footprint, and in some cases close to Benedict Park, where there used to be a historical flue run, I believe, that was buried that traveled that direction. Evaluation of the risks associated with long-term exposures, we're thinking years, decades, lifetimes, is the main purpose and the focus of the baseline human health risk assessment. Again, we're focusing on commercial and industrial exposures, and recreational exposures, which are some of the current uses, as well as the unhoused population exposures. And again, these exposure scenarios greatly differ than the traditional sheltered residential exposures, which were evaluated for the neighborhoods as part of OU1. This is just a compilation now, the receptor pathway network assembled together, where we're going from sources of exposure. As you've seen these two halves before, at least parts of them. You have releases on the left going through different release mechanisms and transport media into exposure media. These are places in the environment where people could be exposed, and then the route, and then the circles filled in mean they're probably complete. It might be significant. Not filled in just illustrates we think they're either not complete or likely not to be very significant, just as a high level understanding of how we go about thinking about linking exposure to release and transport. And this is some information I presented probably a couple of years ago now, thinking about the conceptual site model. So just a couple slides to summarize real quick. I don't know if our hydrogeologist was able to join us tonight, but I had collaborated with her and she provided these kind of summary notes for understanding kind of hydrogeology of the site. So is our understanding that there's little potential for surface water that infiltrated through site material like slag to be directly interacting with groundwater. It's not saying it doesn't happen. It just doesn't seem to be happening to a great extent. Some of the reasons for that is the hydrogeology of OU2 is characterized by a flat site adjacent to a steep drainage gradient with direct flow to the Arkansas. There's less concern for potential for groundwater contamination because of water movement or precipitation that encounters material from the site, including slag, will quickly move through the surface waters rather than infiltrate downward and therefore leach. So it seems to be more moving across the surface than leaching down to the groundwater. There are certainly high concentrations of lead and arsenic present in the slag piles and contaminated soils, particularly again around the central OU2 ravine, and surface water, in some cases sediment concentrations of arsenic and lead decrease significantly, moving from that central area to the north and off-site. Last summary slide, thinking about human exposures, again, thinking about the initial concerns of understanding movement of contamination by leaching, by precipitation, by wind migration or whatever, and then the relevance of some of the information we collect to human health exposures and risk assessment. So the bioavailability is the human health relevant side. That's kind of analogous to leaching, but it uses a different kind of scenario because we want to mimic the human stomach and not necessarily the conditions that exist out in the environment from acid rain or from perhaps a landfill. We do use this information. It's very, very, very relevant. And the bioavailability, again, in some of those slag pile samples seemed much higher than we expected and much higher than the contamination in the nearby surface soil fractions. So not only is the high concentrations present in the slag, it also could be potentially highly bioavailable. Conceptual site model, as I've mentioned a couple times, is just a method, a tool we use for understanding and integrating information from various lines of investigation to understand how contamination was released to the environment initially, how it moved through the environment, how it could still be moving and migrating through the environment, and how people could be exposed. And then constructing pathways of a human exposure, like a commercial receptor, that's someone working in a commercial facility, or perhaps an outdoor worker, a maintenance worker, or a recreator, someone playing in the park, or in this case specifically, also being concerned about the unhoused people who until recently were residing on the site, on on top of slag piles, or perhaps in caves made out of slag, perhaps also interacting with the surface water. And just a shout out and a footnote to our colleagues at the state level, the Colorado Department of Health, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment had been working under an agreement with ATSDR, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, which is part of another acronym, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, to do the public health consultation. They were focusing their evaluation on the unhoused population as well. So again, thank you for your time, your patience and your attention. I see more than one or two questions in the chat. So let me ask, should I stop sharing, or how do you want to proceed, Ryan or anyone?
Jason, first of all, thank you so much. And there's a couple of questions just of the appreciation for this presentation. So I want to give people a chance to say something about that. I see Jimmy clapping. And also, I think a question, Jimmy, you had at some point about, liver versus, contamination impacts on the human body, that sort of thing. So I wonder if we could just open it up to anyone who wants to reiterate one of those questions or comments. You may have gotten it answered.
Okay, let me stop sharing that.
Yeah, perfect. Does anyone want to, and I think people can just put up their hands if they want to chime in with a question or comment. And yeah, Joan, go ahead.
Hi, I couldn't find my way back to the unmute.
No worries.
So that was a great presentation. One thing I've learned, which unfortunately I'm at a loss now to figure out how to get through this one, and maybe you can help. We had a situation in Colorado, up in the Denver area, where they had the smelter, several smelters in that area. And the one thing that surfaced recently was looking at what the community had asked for. This had to do with CDOT and the location of that highway through the community, Globeville, Elyria, Swansea. But the Asarco Globe brought to our attention something that we didn't realize, and I didn't realize, boy, I know that term now, called cumulative risk assessments. And we know that EPA's risk assessment right now, they deal with cancer, and they're not really looking at the non-cancer risk assessment, health impacts, et cetera. But back to the cumulative risk assessment, that means, well, you take a look at all the chemicals that anyone can be exposed to, and you add them up, and then you tell the community, not just looking at arsenic or lead, you take all the potential chemicals, heavy metals, and radionuclides that should be brought together and combined to give the public the truth about what is a cumulative risk. And as I said, we've been taught cumulative risk assessment could not be done in the Denver area for the community recently. And we were waiting 5 years to see what was going on. And they said, basically we can only do epidemiological reviews. But so when you hear health risk assessments, EPA at this point admits there is no way we can give you an answer on how all the cumulative risk from adding up all the potential chemicals, all the heavy metals, and the radionuclides, to tell the public what really is your exposure from adding up all of the chemicals that that you can find. Thank you. Sorry,
No, you're good. I was
long-winded.
wondering if you had a question at the end or if it was just sort of a comment along those lines, but Joan, it sounds like more of a comment.
I
So
apologize. I wanted to find
good.
out, and the reason I got so long-winded
no problem.
was I would like to hear just a comment quickly about telling the community, if you would, the gentleman that just presented, about cumulative risk assessments, health risk assessments, I apologize, and what his comments are that he could give the community about a cumulative risk assessment.
And I wonder, Joan, I am happy to have that answered, but I also see 3 different hands up from CAG members with probably more localized questions. So I wonder if we could come back to that question. I've written it down.
When you say localized, I apologize. What did you mean? I was looking at the slag, and I know
You're talking about, okay, so you're
I'm talking about the slag, which I apologize. I should have been more up to date about what's going on. But anyway, you're in the slag piles now.
Okay.
And I was just shocked about how anybody got in there, who is responsible for keeping people out. And number 3, to tell the community there's more than just arsenic or lead to have to deal with in that area.
Okay, gotcha. So Jason, do you want to say anything about the question about cumulative risk assessments regarding the slag? And then let's go to, I see Velma, Jimmy, and Herrick hands up with a note in the chat from Herrick.
Sure. Yeah, I see a bunch of hands up, so I'll try to be concise. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I certainly can't comment really about activities that are going on other sites right now because we're focused on Colorado Smelter, but the general question of cumulative impact assessment and cumulative risk assessment, which are 2 somehow different, but don't ask me to describe how different they are, things the agency has provided guidance on and has scheduled meetings. The National Academy of Science is also conducting meetings in this area. This topic of, especially with a focus on environmental justice, or more specifically on communities who have experienced environmental injustice, and this topic. So a couple clarifications. We do consider non-cancer and cancer risks, absolutely. We consider risks from all contaminants of potential concern. I just illustrated lead and arsenic for convenience of not talking through a laundry list of chemicals for the purposes of this presentation. The human health risk assessment process for Superfund goes through a very intensive screening and selection process to understand the contaminants that were released, the contaminants that may pose a potential concern, the contaminants that were identified to be of concern based on risk exceedances, and then what will be eventually identified as having risk-based goals, and then their cleanup decisions happen after that as part of risk management. To one of the points about cumulative, yes, we do take some factors into account. We have in the past, we're trying to take more. We specifically do cumulative risk assessment for lead, for non-cancer effects. So it's important to understand for lead specifically, we have a lot of information which allows us to do cumulative risk for lead. Now, other things impact cognition and development. We can't necessarily add the things that we don't have quantitative information. So we try to use more qualitative approaches. And these are described in some of the agency's guidances and best practices or kind of ongoing workshop recommendations from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine for how you go about trying to factor in other impacts in communities suffering environmental injustice or communities with multiple impacts when there's not necessarily quantitative data that we can use. So that's the best attempt I can give to of kind of broad questions in a concise manner, understanding that other folks have their hands up and being respectful of their folks' time.
Thanks, Jason. Well, in terms of Herrick, Herrick, I don't know if this is your question, is the same one that you put in the chat, but you can see what Herrick's question in the chat. It had to do with the quantity. First of all, great presentation, and that his questions are more about the quantity of data that's been gathered. And that his understanding is that most of the water and air testing is only done quarterly, which equaled once a quarter over the course of a year. This method of testing doesn't take into account severe weather conditions that this region experiences. So I wonder if you or anyone wants to comment on that. Herrick, Herrick, I know that this is something that you have continuing concerns about. So if you want to say more about that.
I guess I don't. Real quick, I spent the time to write the question, so I was just hoping you'd read the question because I thought it would be more concise that way.
Yeah, I just,
The reason I raised my
tried to-
hand was to, I'll just say real quick, great presentation. The problem I am having with the process is that there's not been enough data collected at the site, especially when testing the air and water. It is my understanding is that most of the water and air tests were only done quarterly, which equaled once a quarter over the course of a year, so like 4 times. This method of testing does not take into account the severe weather conditions this region experiences at various times throughout any given year. I would like to see better testing procedures, which I believe would show there's a much greater risk of the contamination to people and the environment than the current testing is capturing. So, that is how I feel. That I just like the result of, the response to how much testing was done, to come up with all of this. And thank you, Joan, for bringing up what you just did about the cumulative risk assessment, because I do think that's something that we don't talk about enough at this site, that we have a lot of contaminants. This site had 5 smelters within about a 4-mile radius at one point in time. We've still got one of the largest steel mills in America going, less than a mile from it, which has a massive imprint, bigger than all of these other smelter sites combined. So I do think that we should take a greater look at what contaminants that we see and where they are. And as a CAG and a community member, I'd like to see a little more transparency of, how bad things really are. And I'll just reiterate that now that they have cleared a lot of the debris down there, it'd be great to go do some of this testing that has not been done. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Herrick. And Jason, do you want to say anything about that and what you can and can't comment on?
I appreciate the questions, Herrick. I really do. I don't know if I have any new information I could add. Really, I was focusing this presentation on understanding fate and transport, and certainly we want to have representative sampling that gives us an accurate characterization of the current site conditions, and some understanding of what happened in the past. I can't really speak that much to the groundwater, surface water, pore water sampling. I helped deploy and take some of those samples, but our hydrogeologist is really Sarah's the master of that data in her head, and she can explain things in a way that I just haven't been able to wrap my head around entirely. So, I don't know if I could provide more information that's helpful for that. Perhaps in a future meeting, we could circle back to that question if it's not already on the standing list.
I will definitely record it, Herrick, and we'll mention it to Sarah. And I see Beth just went off mute.
Yeah, and I know Sydney had to jump off. She's really better at talking about that stuff than I am, so I don't want to give like a poor answer. So I think if we could circle back to it, that'd be great. So noted.
Yeah,
Thank you,
I'll
Herrick.
definitely record it. Thanks, Herrick. Okay, Jimmy, and then I think Velma, maybe you had your hand up, but go ahead, Jimmy.
Yeah, I don't know where to start, Jason. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. It really is informative. This is the second time I've seen it, and I could watch it 3 more times, actually.
You're way too kind. Thank you, Jimmy.
So we were talking about the stomach and the effects of the lead and arsenic in the stomach and how it gets dispersed into the body. But what about the kidneys and liver? Because I don't think the kidneys and liver have the capability to get rid of lead and arsenic.
Yeah, excellent question in terms of, and that would focus under the topic of what we call target organ toxicity or critical effect toxicity. And you're absolutely right. At very high levels of ingestion, you will overwhelm a variety of different, somewhat normal processes the body has in the stomach, the kidneys, and the liver to clear out any natural things that you don't want in your body, natural things that are part of your waste, and also things in the environment that come in at high levels. And there's a very complicated dynamic between different metals in the environment, like zinc and lead, arsenic, calcium, and lead, that make a simple explanation complicated. But suffice to say, yes, at very high levels of exposure, you'll have a decrease in your body's ability to remove them. It's not that your body can't. Your body has been handling small levels of various metals that are naturally present in the environment for your life, most likely. I don't know anyone's personal life experiences, but I'm assuming that if you participate in society and you go outside, you're going to have some levels that your body is able to clear at a certain rate. Now, those clearance processes are depend on the person and your situation and your diet and your health and other kind of health conditions, and they go down usually over time. As we age, things kind of slow down and break down and don't work as well. And then having higher levels in the environment could have a more negative impact on that already kind of decreased clearance. So it's entirely possible, and it's will happen that if you get exposed to more lead, there's less lead your body's able to clear out as effectively. For lead specifically, we have what we call biokinetic models that allow us to estimate what we think the steady state. That's kind of the if your lead levels go like this, the steady state would kind of be that middle average that you draw through that sine wave. The biokinetic models we use estimate how much that blood level might be based on the estimated soil, water, air concentrations, our understanding of children or adult ingestion and activity patterns, and allow us to model really in kind of a holistic sense for lead from all exposures, what the blood level might be. And then we tie our understanding of how much danger, how much risk there is based on that blood level. And the most sensitive effects are in children, are the neurocognitive effects, but definitely at much higher levels, typically in adults or even in children, you could see impacts on the kidney, on the liver, on other systems, on respiratory function, cardiovascular disease in adults. But typically in children, you would see other effects like behavioral or cognitive effects at much lower concentrations before you would start seeing those effects on the kidney and the liver, which tend to be either more robust or at least the effects aren't as sensitive as we can detect in the learning and cognition in children. But to kind of long-winded answer, I'm sorry, but to your original point, yes, metals like lead, arsenic, and other metals as well can definitely impact your body's digestive organ clearance organs, the kidneys and liver, in ways that are definitely bad for health. Sometimes those are most sensitive effects. For some metals, they could be. For lead, other effects happen at much lower doses before you would see liver and kidney. And did that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, so of course I'm a homeless advocate, and my concern is for the unhoused people who are living down there, and what kind of treatment plan we could come up with to try to figure out what their physical health condition is now that they have been exposed at those higher levels.
I am not a physician. I'm a different kind of doctor. I'm sure Velma could school me in a number of ways on what could be done. I think she actually has introduced a question or a comment into the chat, asking about target organ effects included in a health survey of those living on the site if they can be reached. I don't know of any plans. I don't know of any plans to do that right now. In terms of very severe cases, there could be physician supervised chelation. You basically add something into the body that draws lead out of the blood into it, and then you pass this molecule out. I'm not saying that lightly. I think there's a lot of hazards associated with that. That's not something we as EPA would do. Happy to hear more discussion, but as of right now, I don't have any leads on any work that we're doing to follow up regarding the population of unhoused that was residing on the site that has been dispersed.
Thanks. And Velma, I see your hand up, and I don't know if anyone from the local health department wants to chime in here, but yeah, thanks, Jimmy, for the questions.
Sure, just a real quick follow-up on if, as Jason's pointing out, we know that chronic lead exposure, long-term ongoing lead exposure in adults also has health effects, although they're different than the health effects in children. For example, in adults, one of the effects, we usually see it in workers mainly, like people working in radiator repair shops or things like that, is high blood pressure due to the effects of lead on the kidneys. That's one of the real well-known ones. Chelation or using medication to aggressively remove the lead from the bloodstream is not something that we do for the low level and when I say low level, I mean comparatively lower levels of lead exposure. Even somebody with a fairly toxic level of lead in their body, the first treatment is to stop the exposure. Because if you use, and the medication is not a picnic either. So if you use the medication to take the lead out of the bloodstream, then two things happen besides the blood lead going down. The stored lead comes out of the bones and starts going back into the bloodstream because now there's room for it. And so oftentimes you find the blood lead going back up again. And then also, if they're still being exposed, you're just taking out the most recent lead and they're still being exposed to it. So that's kind of, many years ago, I treated children with extreme levels of lead with chelation. But those were kids with active brain damage going on at the moment due to their lead levels. And the chelation was pretty hard on the kids. So, but they were going to die if they didn't get it. So it's that kind of thing.
Thanks, Velma. Well, everybody, it's 7:15. I do want to wrap up this part of the meeting, but I'm wondering, are there any other final comments, final questions, even ones just to capture in the notes to come back to? I think just a huge thank you, Jason, to you and for doing this again and being willing to come back in the evening.
Sure, not a problem. Thank you all for your questions, your interest, your dedication, absolutely for your time, which is as valuable, if not more valuable than my own. I really do appreciate that. I'm happy to stick around for the rest of the meeting. But yeah, and I hadn't had a chance to read through the 30-something comments that came in during the presentation. So forgive me if I didn't touch all the pertinent ones, but I think we have a process for collecting them and addressing them at a future meeting.
Yep, we do. And it's true. There's a huge appreciation for everyone who's here and made efforts to be here, especially those who aren't being paid to be here and are just here on behalf of their community. So thanks everybody. So before we conclude the meeting, a couple of things. One is to just talk about upcoming meetings, and it's pretty soon, it's gonna be 2025, and we wanted to touch base on that. So as we discussed at the last meeting, I am not gonna be available for the December meeting, and we talked about how sometimes we skip those meetings, CAG meetings anyways, because of the holiday time. So the CAG agreed to skip that meeting, but I wanted to check in with you all to see if you wanted to have a steering committee meeting or a meeting with Viola, who's generously offered as the task advisor to the CAG, on anything in December, or just wait until the January meeting. So does anyone have any comments or suggestions or thoughts about that? And otherwise, I think the January meeting will be, let me just give you the exact dates, the second Tuesday in January. So it'll be the 14th will be our next regularly scheduled meeting. And maybe one thing we can do while people are thinking about this is, Beth, I wonder if we can hear from you thoughts from EPA about topics that are going to be timely in the early part of next year, just so people can be thinking about that.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So one thing that is top of mind for me, and I know for many of you, is the lead guidance change and what that implications will look like for the site. So I am working on a really nice graphic that you guys are going to love, showing kind of the time frame and like what the processes look like internally, and then when it goes to public comment and just so you can track all of it on one slide. I know y'all remember Charles, he did a nice little visual, so I'm kind of stealing some of what he did, but hoping to bring that. Yes, and Herrick, January will be in person. So that's one of the main topics that I know I want to talk about in January. I'm hoping we'll have a little bit more information on that, even just outlining the process. So that's a big topic for January. I think kind of moving into 2025, I'm hoping that we'll have more on the OU2 remedial investigation. I know that we this year released the screening level ecological risk assessment, which is one of the first ecological risk assessment. There's then a baseline ecological risk assessment. I expect to have that in 2025, so that will be on the agenda when we have it. And then there will also be the human health risk assessment for OU2. So those are kind of upcoming topics. I'm expecting both of those in 2025. The timelines could move around, as y'all always hear me say, but I'm expecting those as they kind of come up in 2025. And then obviously lead guidance whenever we have, we did discuss, so I just want to flag this, that we asked CAG members if y'all wanted to talk about public comment opportunities, effective ways to do public comments. We expect to have an explanation of significant differences document potentially, and how to comment on things like public comment opportunities, things like that, just how to comment. And then when we have the public comment period, so just laying that out, that will be a CAG topic. And those are really the topics that I have been tracking.
Great. Yeah, at the last meeting, we did talk about, CAG members did say that it would be really helpful to spend some time on, you know, public comment. To what extent is it useful to have individual comments and collective CAG comments? What kind of weight do they carry? How are they considered and responded to, et cetera? So thanks, Beth. Yeah, Jimmy, please.
Yeah, when are we gonna tour the site, the OU2 site? Is it tomorrow or Thursday? And can I be present?
So Jimmy, I think we need to talk as a team about that. It's going to be on Thursday, but right now the property owner has not given us access for other folks other than EPA and our contractor. So we need to look into seeing if that is a possibility. So I got your ask, but I need to loop around with the team on that one.
Okay, so you'll respond to Jimmy and anyone else who may want to hear whether that's possible for them to join.
Yes.
Okay. Velma.
Yeah, just sort of following up on Jimmy's question. And I think for a lot of us, I'm not really all that physically capable to go up and down the site anyway. But Jimmy's question causes me to wonder if Erica, if you're planning on, or anybody else with you, planning on videotaping or taking still photos of your site tour. Hypothetically, as a result of the city's actions, there should not be any remaining privacy concerns to prevent videotape of the site, and at least still photos.
So Velma, let me respond. I know Erica's on here, so I think Erica, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we are planning to get some videos and photos, but Velma, I want to clarify the sub-bureaucracy here, so like give me a little bit of patience. EPA does still have rules and regulations around photos and videos. It is still privately owned property. So I think kind of what we've done in the past, if we've taken some videos and then we've like screen shared them where we're not really posting them like online for everyone to see it. So I think that's an avenue that we've used in the past. I feel comfortable doing something like that, of like showing CAG members what we've seen, but posting them publicly, that's kind of a different story without the property owner's permission. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Jesus Christ.
Oh.
Oh, sorry.
No worries. Okay, so that's great. Thank you, Beth, for clarifying that. And it sounds like stay tuned that EPA will find out if they're able to have other folks on the property since it's privately owned. Anything else? Yeah, Joan, I see your hand up.
I am really sorry. I thought it was on mute. I hope that.
No worries.
Who owns the slag pile?
Yeah. Beth, do you
So
wanna?
there's a private property owner, John Starr, who owns the slag pile.
So the slag pile didn't have anything to do with the smelter?
Yes.
Okay, that answered it for me. Thanks, Velma. Yeah, I'm going, wait a minute. One person owns this and the city is now trying to bring, you've had homeless people living in that area and nobody did anything? You're kidding.
It's been
I
a
know you're not
major
kidding.
topic of the CAG meetings, you can imagine.
Oh, you
Because
guys, I'm so
it's a
sorry.
major concern.
I
So,
don't think we ever had that up in the Denver area where homeless were in the slag pile. That is just an amazing and why it's now, okay, I'm shutting up now. This one's a shock. After I'm a old lady now and looking at this, I went, oh, I missed this part. Shoot.
thanks.
Good luck to you guys. Yeah. Ooh.
Thank you. All right. Well, so Jimmy, stay tuned. Any other final comments or about upcoming CAG topics before we wrap here?
Ryan, the other thing that I thought of while I was sitting here was the community involvement plan updates. I know we planned to do it this year, but then when the lead guidance changed, I wanted to see what the implications of that would be before I did community interviews, instead of interviewing you this year and then like immediately interviewing you again next year if something changed. So I'm kind of waiting to see what comes out of the lead guidance change before moving forward with that community involvement process. But something that we had talked about previously was the previous community involvement plan was really focused on operable unit 1, the community properties and commercial properties. And in this new community involvement plan, as we've talked a lot about OU2 tonight, we're trying to bring a little bit more focus to people who should be involved with the former smelter area.
Yep. Great. Thank you for explaining that.
That's one more question.
Yeah.
Are Velma and I still gonna be doing testing down at OU2? I remember that we had a plan for us to actually start sampling the soils and stuff down there. Was that it? Am I correct?
Not that I know of. I mean, not for me to be doing. I'm sorry if I didn't understand or missed something.
Was that a question for Velma, Jimmy, or somebody else?
No, for you guys.
Yeah, Jimmy, are you
Didn't
talking about our research project on the
Yeah.
exposures they unhoused? Yeah, we were talking a bit about taking soil and slag samples, but that would be later. We were first focusing on understanding the way that the unhoused people were living and moving through the site in terms of how much water they might be exposed to, and how much soil, and then maybe later capturing more samples on that. But that was going to be a year and a half. We do have to rethink this approach now because we don't know if unhoused people will be living on the site in the future. There currently aren't any right now. So we're currently working with our support contractor to figure out how to do that. But that for right now is kind of on hold. Honestly, we're working with the contractor. That process will take another couple months anyway. But we are trying to be strategic about how we structure the tasks we want to do to collect information about how unhoused people either on the site or at some other location, perhaps NGOs like Project Apollo and some of the other health-based NGOs could help us identify in the future. But for right now, it's kind of been, yes, sidetracked by the removal of unhoused from OU2.
Okay, so this is sort of a TBD and that you'll loop Project Apollo and other community members in as useful.
Yeah, we talk about this during that monthly meeting that was mentioned earlier. Absolutely.
Okay, got it. Perfect, with the NGOs and EPA.
Yes.
Got it. All right, thank you. Any other final, and Velma, thanks for your comment on in the chat. Final comments before we wrap up 5 minutes early? Doesn't it feel like 9:30 now that it's dark? It feels so late. Thanks everyone for staying on for so long. Big appreciation for all of you. And I think we're gonna wrap and we'll see everybody in early January, and certainly we'll be in touch by email with site updates and this presentation. A couple of you have asked, Jason, we're gonna be sharing the slides by email, and then the presentation itself, the recording, will be uploaded onto the CAG website, along with the other recorded presentations. So
sure. I think I sent a PDF in August, but if you need me to send it again, let me know.
Nope,
Yeah, I'll forward that along. Thanks, Jason.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks again, everybody. Have a wonderful night. Stay warm, and we'll talk to you soon.
Merry Christmas,
Bye.
Happy New Year.
Exactly.
everyone.
Happy holidays. Enjoy the snow.
You know.